Hello, hello. My name is Gabriel Said Reynolds. I'm a professor of Islamic Studies and Theology at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to this channel exploring the Quran and the Bible, and especially to this particular episode where I discuss all sorts of things with Professor Tannous of Princeton University. He is a really smart and interesting guy, and I think you're really going to like this discussion. We cover things like late antiquity, monks, priests, and simple believers in late antiquity. He'll explain what that means, a simple believer. We'll speak about the historical context of the Quran and how that can be a key to understanding the text better, and also the way Muslims and Christians interacted in the earliest period of Islam. So enjoy the conversation, but before you enjoy the conversation, take a moment to like this episode and to subscribe to this channel. There's lots more good content coming. Hello, Professor Tannous.
Hello.
Thank you for being here and speaking with me a bit about your research and scholarship in Syriac and Greek and Arabic. And we won't get all of those things in maybe exhaustive detail, but I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to start off just by introducing you a little bit for our viewers. Professor Tannous is Associate Professor of History. He is the Director of Hellenic Studies and Chair at the Center for the Study of Late Antiquity. He's also in the Department of History and all that at Princeton University. Tell me if I get something wrong here. We spoke a little bit before recording to try to make sure I get it right, but just in case. His research focuses on the Syriac-speaking communities of the Near East in this period, that is late antiquity, but also early Islam. He also works on Eastern Christian studies more broadly, patristics, early Christian studies, Greco-Syriac, Greco-Arabic translation, Christian-Muslim interactions, sectarianism and identity, early Islamic history, the history of the Arabic Bible, and the Quran, which is dear to us on this YouTube channel. And he is interested in manuscripts generally and the editing of Syriac and Arabic, especially Christian Arabic texts. Does that sound okay so far?
Pretty good, yeah.
Okay, and the list of his works is so long that I'll just mention, and we're going to spend some time speaking about his monumental book entitled The Making of the Medieval Middle East, Religion, Society, and Simple Believers, published by Princeton University Press in 2018. He is working on another book on Syriac scholarship in Greco-Syriac translation, Greco-Syriac. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. And excuse me, he has also edited and translated the Syriac letters of George, Bishop of the Arabs, as well as the Karshuni life of Theodota of Amid. And the CV is super long, so find Professor Tannous at Princeton University website, and you'll see an example of all of his really remarkable contributions to scholarship. So I'm just looking forward to casual conversation about all of these topics, but maybe with a special focus on the Quran, as most of the conversations here about the Quran and the Bible. And I'd like to start off just with a sort of biographical note. Can you tell us how you entered into the field of Middle Eastern, Syriac, Christian Arabic studies?
Well, it's sort of like kind of like the house that Jack built. One thing led to another. I'm from Houston, Texas. My father's from Lebanon, and my grandparents are from Jaffa. His parents are from Jaffa. And at the University of Texas, a long time ago now, I ended up sort of by accident majoring in Arabic and majoring in Middle Eastern studies. And my family are Christians from the Middle East. And I became very interested in just trying to figure out the history of Middle Eastern Christianity. It wasn't a thing I had really learned much about or, in my classes. And one thing led to another, and I ended up going to Oxford and studying Syriac with Sebastian Brock and David Taylor, and then coming to Princeton and doing a doctorate here at Princeton on the subject of essentially on the subject of Christians in the Middle East in the late antique and medieval period. So it sort of comes out of my biography. My interest does. So it's been a lot of fun.
Can I follow up a little bit about the question of Syriac, and maybe we should take a step back too and just you could explain, what is Syriac, and maybe you could answer that question for us, and also maybe address how did you turn towards Syriac in particular, because you mentioned Middle Eastern Christians and coming from the Levant generally on your father's side, but how did you get to Syriac, and what is Syriac?
So I was taking Arabic at University of Texas, and I became mesmerized by it. It's a very beautiful language. It sort of, one of my teachers told me, it works like algebra. As I was learning Arabic and falling in love with the language, I was also having these questions like, what about Middle Eastern Christians? How does Middle Eastern Christianity fit into the picture of the region that I'm learning in my classes? And I somehow came across this language called Syriac, and kind of through my readings, I'd realized that it was an important language for the history of Middle Eastern Christianity, but it wasn't a language that was taught anywhere in Texas, or anywhere within probably 1,000 miles of where I was living.
Right.
So sort of, I ended up teaching myself Syriac. I got some books from the library, ordered a book off the internet, the Syriac Primer by George Kiraz, the older version of it, where it's the tape of him reading out words in Syriac, and there's a parrot in the background and a plane flying. Oh, you can even get this. These tapes are, probably worth a lot of money on eBay now. You can't get them anymore. And so I taught myself Syriac. I took Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, to help me sort of get another sense for another Semitic language, also interested in the Bible. And so on the basis of Hebrew and Arabic, I taught myself Syriac. And then I went to work with Sebastian Brock. Now, what is Syriac? Syriac is just the name that scholars give to the Aramaic dialect of Edessa. What is Aramaic? Aramaic is another Semitic language. It's a cousin to Hebrew, a cousin to Arabic. Now, scholars debate what language Jesus spoke. Jesus probably spoke Aramaic. He maybe spoke a little bit of Greek too. Probably could read some Hebrew if he could read. Anyways, and he's portrayed as reading in the gospel, so whatever. And so it's the name of a dialect of Aramaic. Like if we called Australian English Australian and didn't call it English, it's still English. And so it's the Syriac dialect of Edessa, which was the second most important city in northern Mesopotamia. If you took all the Aramaic in the world and put it into a room, something like 90% of it would be Syriac. It's the most largest literary corpus in Aramaic is by far Syriac.
Right.
Syriac. The earliest inscription, I think, is from AD 6, and people are writing it to this day. You can text on, if you have an Android phone, you can send text in Syriac.
It has its own script. I mean, that one thing that distinguishes it from other Aramaic dialects.
It has its own, so that's the thing about Aramaic is many Aramaic dialects have their own alphabet. Syriac actually has 3 different alphabets, or even 4 if you count the so-called Melkite scripts. So there's maybe four alphabets of Syriac. And so it has its own script, but it's Aramaic. And so, classic and Arabic peace is salam, and Hebrew it's shalom, in Aramaic it's shlama or shlomo in the Western pronunciation. So Syriac is it's a dialect of Aramaic, and it becomes the literary lingua franca of much of the Middle East over the course of the late antique period into the Middle Ages. Eventually, it's replaced by Arabic as the most important language for Christians in the Middle East. But
it's just my sense is that when people think of the Middle East, they assume that it's sort of monolingual. Basically, everything is Arabic. Of course, there are other Islamic languages, including Turkish and Persian, in the Middle East. But the sort of the profound heritage of residents of the Middle East that was preserved in Syriac, I think, is lost on a lot of people. In Quranic studies, there's some interest in Syriac, and we're going to touch on that in a bit. And there was a very controversial book by someone named Christoph Luxemburg called the Syro-Aramaic Reading of the Quran. But I think, Westerners looking at the Middle East think it's all Arabic. And then sometimes, in my experience, I'm not sure about yours, spending time in Arabic-speaking countries, especially in the Levant, where Syriac had such a profound heritage in Syria and Lebanon in particular. Many people are not aware of that part of their own history, So
they're not. And the thing is, too, there's also sort of a sectarian association with Syriac. So it has survived in the Middle East in certain churches. So the Maronite Church, the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Syrian Catholic Church, the Assyrian Orthodox Church, the Chaldean Church will all use Syriac, maybe not so much today, but depending on the church, maybe a lot today, in their liturgy. The Greek Orthodox Church, a so-called Rum, do not associate Syriac with their own heritage, although the Rum actually used Syriac widely into, say, the 16th century, and there are even some places in Syria into the early 19th century that the Rum are still using Syriac.
Interesting.
And so one of the biggest collections of Syriac manuscripts in the world actually is in St. Catherine's Monastery, which is in the Sinai of Egypt, which is a Greek Orthodox, a Rum monastery. And so there were other kinds of Aramaic that were almost certainly mutually intelligible with Edessene Aramaic. And the fact that a church celebrated a liturgy in that language, or that people wrote in that language, doesn't mean that they were actually speaking that language on the ground. So people may have sort of prayed in Edessene Aramaic, but they may have spoken a different kind of Aramaic to their kids or with their family, with their friends.
Right.
One medieval lexicographer lists 16 different dialects of Aramaic. He in the course of his dictionary, and that must have been the tip of the iceberg. We know today that what remains of Aramaic in places like Iraq and southeastern Turkey, there might be that village to village might be different dialects.
So maybe roughly analogous. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
Go for it.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe roughly analogous to the experience of Arabic, and Middle Eastern Arabic speakers will pray, and even just in formal conversation will speak in Fusha, in the formal modern standard Arabic, and they'll pray in Quranic Arabic. But there are many different dialects in which, even within a single Arabic-speaking country, there'll be many dialects. So.
Yes, that's a great analogy. There's a diglossia. You write in one language, you use one language in a formal context, but then you use a dialect sort of in an informal everyday context. I think that's the way it is with Edessene Aramaic in late antiquity. I should also add that there's a little bit of a linguistic confusion about the word Syriac, because the word Syriac up into the 19th century, it was just the word that was used generically for the word for Aramaic. If you look at Daniel 2:4, in the King James version of the Bible, it says in the astrologers or whatever it is that spoke to him in Syriac. Look at that in the King James version. Beginning to say the late 19th, early 20th century, they start translating that as Aramaic. So in older works, the 19th century and earlier, in various European languages, the word Syriac just means Aramaic more generically. It's only in the late 19th, early 20th century that scholars start using Syriac to designate Edessene Aramaic, and Aramaic is a more blanket term for other dialects of Aramaic. Also, in medieval Arabic, the word Soriani doesn't necessarily mean Edessene Aramaic. It just means Aramaic more generally. So the word Syriac has actually undergone a shift, sort of a silent shift in the late 19th, early 20th century. So it used to just mean Aramaic. Now it means Edessene Aramaic, the way it's used by scholars. And not to confuse people out there, but that's, so if you read older, because of Google Books and archive.org, you can read older things now that have sort of been liberated from the tombs of the dusty old libraries. And you'll see the word Syriac used, but it can often, in older literature, it can mean just Aramaic more generally.
Well, I think it's really important to clarify. I don't think you've confused things. I think you've clarified things because, for many people, I mean, there are a number of mysterious elements to linguistic questions in language, but also to Middle Eastern Christianity generally. We might sort through some of those things in speaking about the different churches, the names of which you've mentioned, at least some of them. I wanted to ask next, I was going to ask, so why should one study Syriac or Christian Arabic? I think you've kind of answered that already, but if you want to follow up on that question, like what is the interest in studying that? But if I can ask, in addition, maybe your assessment of the academic field of Christian Arabic and Syriac. I don't know if it's even fair to put the two together, but oftentimes, scholars are working on both of those literary corpora or heritage. So yeah, I mean, could you address, but generally, if you feel like something's missing, why would someone go into this field? And then also, what is the state of the field? Is it healthy? Is there a lot of work going on, etc.?
So why should you study Syriac? So if you're interested in the history of Christianity, after Greek and Latin, Syriac is the most important language of Christian antiquity. Syriac is interesting too, because there are Syriac churches outside the Roman Empire. It's the so-called Nestorian church, which is, it's a misnomer, it's a misleading term.
Yeah, it's important to say that you still encounter it a lot, and it's not something that's adopted by the community itself, right?
No, in the 8th century, there are people who call themselves Nestorians. They sort of adopt the term. This is not widely known, but people actually start calling themselves Nestorians in the community. But it's widely, and this is like a very small point in a footnote. You can do this is sort of whatever, but it's typically seen as being a misleading a misapplication, a misnomer, an incorrect label for this community. But there is a church that exists outside the Roman Empire. It's called the Church of the East. You'll see it referred to as, again, the so-called Nestorian Church. But they, by the year 635, have got missionaries in China. And over the course of late antiquity into the Middle Ages, they evangelize huge areas. They have bishops in Tibet. They've got bishops across the Silk Road. They have missionaries in China. And so at one point, it's the most geographically widespread church in the world. They may, I don't know, demographics are tricky, but it's a very, very large church in the Middle Ages. So it's a church. So after Greek and Latin, Syriac is the most important Christian language of antiquity. Syriac has people using Syriac in a Christian context, all the way from Cyprus and Egypt in the West to China, again, in the course of late antiquity. Because of the Islamic conquest, there are these, we're probably going to talk about this in a little bit, there are Christological disputes. The Islamic conquest sort of frees these churches. They sort of stop the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine Emperor, from trying to make everybody uniform. And so because of the survival of different churches that are non-Chalcedonian, churches that don't agree with the Council of Chalcedon in 451, a large literature is preserved. Syriac has a diversity of theological literature that it's not, it's quite remarkable. You've got sort of non-Orthodox by sort of traditional Roman Catholic, traditional Greek Orthodox, traditional Protestant views text. And I'm not endorsing the views of the non-Orthodox. I'm just saying just by traditional historical sort of canons of Orthodoxy. You've got a large literature of sort of the other side, people who lose at these big councils, that's preserved in Syriac. You've got a large amount of things that are written in Greek that are otherwise lost in Greek because the authors were condemned, that it's preserved in Syriac. There's a great diversity of Christian literature. It's interesting too, because Syriac is never what they call in German a Rechtssprache. It's never an imperial language. After around 212 or so, when the Roman Empire takes over Edessa, there's no longer a language of a court. It's not a language you have to learn to get a job, which makes Syriac interesting. So it's a non-imperial language, which is it's vast. Its usage is vast. It's a non-imperial Christianity, and a series of non-imperial Christianities, which makes it quite interesting. Syriac is also important because, other reasons Syriac's important is there's a huge amount of Greek material, again, that survives only in Syriac. And it's also an important so-called intermediary language. So the translators of Baghdad, the 9th century, most of those guys were from Syriac-speaking churches. I think we have the names of something like 61 different translators. Something like 59 of them belong to churches where Syriac
I think that's a point that's lost on many, right? Sometimes it's assumed that, because they're working in Baghdad, principally, maybe other Middle Eastern cities as well, they were Muslims and principally Arabic speakers, but in fact, there's a significant contribution of Eastern Christians to that movement.
No, most of the vast majority of the translators were Christians from Syriac churches, and a lot of the translations that went into Arabic came out of Syriac first. Because for a variety of reasons, there's a vast Christian literature translated into Greek, from Greek into Syriac. And so when the translations happen in the 9th century, there are people around who know how to translate quite well from Greek into Syriac and then from Syriac into Arabic. And so it's important if you're interested in sort of Greco-Arabica. Apart from all these sort of, you might call them instrumental reasons, like it's good because you're interested in Greek Christian, interested in lost Greek literature, interested in Arabic philosophy. Syriac is important because Syriac it's very beautiful. It's a beautiful language, and there's a beautiful poetry in Syriac. Syriac is the Syriac Christian tradition is a tradition in which the greatest theologians are poets. I remember I was once at a dinner years ago, and I sat between Robert Murray and Peter Brown. Robert Murray's a Jesuit who's since passed away. And I remember Robert Murray telling me he's a great scholar of Syriac. And he'd been born in China. His parents were, I think, Congregationalist missionaries. He converted to Roman Catholicism at Oxford. And I think the doctor who delivered him, I forget now what he told me. I think he was delivered, the doctor also delivered the last Chinese emperor and removed the tonsils of Chiang Kai-shek, or vice versa. Anyways, he told me, if you can't put your theology in poetry, I'm not interested. Right. And so the greatest theologians in Syriac, people like Ephraim the Syrian, Jacob of Sarug, Narsai, these guys all write in poetry, and they write a beautiful poetry, and they have a sort of an approach to the Christian faith, the Christian tradition, which is quite different if you are sort of more used to the Western Christian tradition. And so it's striking. It's a beautiful tradition, a beautiful language, a beautiful literature. And so those are all reasons I would say to study Syriac.
Yeah, I think it's important to get all of that out there, because a lot of the viewers on this channel will be interested principally in what can Syriac tell us about the Quran. And sometimes that's my temptation as well. So speak about instrumental uses of Syriac. There's one. And
so it's instrumentalize it, but it's an end in itself.
Yes, it's an end in itself, right? So then there's the second part of the two-part question, which is what is the field like today in the West, but maybe also in the Middle East or India, other places where Syriac is studied, but maybe you can address also Christian Arabic in that regard.
So I think the field of Syriac studies is absolutely flourishing. It's just exploding. I mean, it's your own institution. Last year was, in terms of the academic job market, one of the worst years ever. But there was a job in Syriac studies last year at Notre Dame. There's a huge interest in Syriac, and people studying early Christianity, people studying the Quran, people studying the history of Judaism. It's also people interested in rabbinic Judaism. I think there's been a realization. It's been slowly dawning, I think, for a number of years now, that while rabbinic Judaism is undergoing its formative period in a place like what's today Iraq, right next door, there are all these, what do you call it? All these Syriac-speaking Christians doing similar things, studying in schools and debating the scripture. And so people who are studying rabbinic Judaism are also very interested in Syriac. So the field is blowing up, both in its from within. There's a lot of interest in people coming into it, but also from sort of neighboring lateral fields, people are coming into it.
Interesting.
And so I think there's a huge. We're living in a sort of another golden age of Syriac studies. There's a golden age in the early 20th century. I think we're in another golden age right now. So it's been really exciting to watch. People like someone like George Kirat. Go for it. I'm sorry.
But I was just going to ask: is the work being done at the same time in Syriac heritage communities, if that's the right expression? So either in the diaspora or in places like Turkey, Syria, India, Iraq, etc.
Yes, I think there's a lot of work going on in the Syrian Orthodox Church. There are very dynamic people, both in the Middle East and also in the diaspora, who are studying the tradition, who are working on manuscripts. One of the most important figures in the world in Syriac studies is George Kiraz, who is a scholar, but also is a publisher. When I met George, I worked with George. I was an impecunious graduate student at Oxford, and Sebastian Brock got me to sell books for one of his former students who had just started a publishing company called Gorgias Press. And so George, back when I first started working for him, he had a full-time job at working for Bell Labs, I think it was. George is like a really serious computer programmer and a computer scientist. And he started Gorgias Press on the side. Now he works full-time with Gorgias and does scholarship. But someone like George has been transformational in the field of Syriac studies. And he is from the community, but he's also a scholar. Roger Achras in the Middle East. He works in, he's recently made a bishop. He works in the Patriarchate. So in India, one of the major centers of Syriac studies in the world is called the St. Ephrem Ecumenical Research Institute in southern India. And so there's a flourishing community of scholars in South India. And in Western Europe, places like Germany, Holland, Sweden, there's a huge interest in Syriac among people in the diaspora community. So we're in a time, it's a good time to be in Syriac studies, really great. Now, Christian Arabic, so another reason Syriac studies is attractive to people is there is so much work to be done in Syriac. There's so many fundamental texts that are unpublished, important things that haven't been translated or studied properly. And so if you're working in sort of Greek or Latin patristics, I feel like, and I love Greek and Latin patristics, don't get me wrong, sort of study of the early church. If you're a graduate student, you can sort of maybe reinterpret a text that was edited in the 16th century by a Benedictine or 17th century by a Benedictine, or you can come in Syriac and actually be the first person to translate
for the first time. Yeah.
It's as someone's told me, the difference between discovery versus reinterpretation. You can still discover things in Syriac now, which is amazing in terms of scholarship, especially in a field like early Christianity, which is so well studied. Now, Christian Arabic is decades, I would say, behind Syriac. There is so much work to be done in Christian Arabic. We lack fundamental instrumenta, so much work to be done. It's a vast literature in Christian Arabic. And so, again, I think there's growing interest in it. But in terms of just the fundamental basic work that needs to be done, it's way behind Syriac, which means it's even more, it's super exciting to work in that as well. Because again, there's a lot of discovery to happen. You can be a pioneer.
Okay, yeah, great. Well, I wonder if we can direct our attention back a few centuries and think about the world of late antiquity, so more than a few centuries from our current moment. And a lot of people watching will be interested in, okay, why does this matter? Why are you guys speaking about Syriac and Christians of the Middle East? And to me, it's a fundamentally important task for understanding the world into which Islam emerges. And so before making direct observations about the nature of the Quran, maybe we're asking you about that, observations about how the Quran engages with the world of Late Antiquity. Could you help us set the scene? It's probably an impossible question to answer succinctly, and maybe a completely unfair question. But who were the Christians of the Middle East at the dawn of Islam in the 6th, early 7th century? What were the principal, we could call churches or ecclesial communities to be a bit fancier? When the first Muslims were listening to the preaching of the Prophet, or Islam was in its initial stages, and what was the world around them like?
It's a good question. So typically, the answer that's traditionally given to that is one based on Christology. What is Christology? It's the study of Christ, the doctrine of who Christ is, what he did, why he's important. And so over the course of late antiquity, the later Roman period, there are a series of controversies in which Christians disagree and discuss and have councils, and they sort of disagree with the councils about this question of who Christ is. Now, in 451, there's a council at a place called Chalcedon, which becomes, I call it the Humpty Dumpty moment of the church. It splits the church apart, and all the king's horses and all the king's men can't put the church back together again after 451. There's a disagreement about the nature of the incarnation. Was Christ incarnate in one nature or two? And so now we can go into details about that. You at Notre Dame, you should get Brian Daly on here to talk about what's going on at Chalcedon. But broadly speaking, there are some groups say Christ was incarnate in one nature, some say he's incarnate in two. And these disagreements lead to the formation of separate churches. And there is a Chalcedonian church, a church that thinks Christ is incarnate in two natures. And there are non-Chalcedonian churches, which there are different kinds of non-Chalcedonian churches. The so-called Church of the East is a non-Chalcedonian church in part because they're not at Chalcedon, they're outside the Roman Empire. But they think Christ is in two natures also. But there's also what's today the Syrian Orthodox Church. It's called the Miaphysite, or again, another polemical word, the Monophysite Church. And this, the Coptic Church of Egypt belongs to this non-Chalcedonian tradition, as does the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, as does the Armenian Orthodox Church. In our period, if our period now is at early 7th century, there are different flavors of Miaphysite churches. And so the Middle Eastern church has fractured in a set of different churches which disagree with each other over the basis of Christology. Now, that's the sort of textbook answer. With that said, there's a question of what do the differences in Chalcedon actually mean to the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the sort of everyday ordinary Christian on the ground?
That's a very interesting point.
That's a big question. And,
right.
I think a lot of, professors can't really explain the differences. And I think there's actually a lot of important things at stake in Chalcedon. And so I'm not trying to slag it off, as they say in England. I'm not trying to downplay or belittle it at all.
Right.
They're very important issues. But I do think they're very easy to understand and misunderstand. And I think it's important to point out that the Middle East in this period, as all pre-modern societies, is one with widespread illiteracy. The population is largely rural and agrarian, mostly peasants. There's no printing press, so you can't go to the local, Christian bookstore and pick up a King James version of the Bible or whatever. You can't do that. And so most people are going to be illiterate or have some sort of basic literacy. And I think most people, to sort of evaluate and figure out, come to a considered judgment on the question of Chalcedon and what do they think Christ has, one nature or two, is probably not to be realistic historically. So I think that for most people, I think probably by the early 7th century, the Middle East has been largely Christianized, at least the Roman part of the Middle East. There are still significant Jewish populations there. There are still some pagans there. What does it mean to be a Christian? I think to be a Christian in this period is to go to the liturgy, to take communion, to take part in the life of the church. I think that's.
And you say that specifically, sorry to cut you off there, but you say that specifically maybe to avoid other definitions which are based on certain theological competency or something like that. Is that?
I would. And so, so I think there are people, and this is maybe some would disagree with me, but there are people who can evaluate Chalcedon, who they're incredibly learned people who know the Bible better than anybody that knows the Bible. They speak Greek, they speak Aramaic, and they're closer to the events of the first century than we are, and the language of the first century than we are. But many people don't have access to these documents, and if they did, they couldn't necessarily read them. And if they could read them, they might not have had access to the training you need to actually understand them and debate and judge them. So I think that to be a Christian, you can believe in Jesus, to use sort of 21st or 20th century slang or not language,
Right.
you might not, you can drink water, but not be able to explain what H2O is, right? So I think that across these different communities, to be a Christian is to attend the liturgy, and maybe you believe in Jesus, but you might not be able to explain the hypostatic union or whatever, right? So I think these church separations, these doctrinal distinctions apart, I think there's a lot of commonality in terms of might venerate saints. You might have, you take part in the liturgical cycle of the year, and you take part in the life of the church. And for you, the Eucharist, the experience of the Eucharist every week. And at the Eucharist, the message of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is proclaimed at every Eucharist, right? And so that, I think, something like that, to take part in the life of the church, is what it means to be a Christian. I think I would say much more for the average butcher, baker, and candlestick maker than to be able to articulate a sort of a considered opinion on the definition of Chalcedon. Makes any sense?
Okay.
So I think while these churches are separated and separating in their late 6th, early 7th century, I think across the boundaries of the different communities, there's a lot of commonality. A lot of similarity between the different.
So there's a couple of anecdotes from Islamic tradition that I want to mention, and maybe we can continue with that thought by responding to them. One is a verse in the Quran, I think it's verse 14 of the 5th chapter or surah, where after speaking about the Israelites in verse 13, verse 14, if I'm getting the verse numbers right, goes on to say, well, because of forgetting things that have been mentioned to them, we have sowed enmity and discord, something like adawata wa baghda, I think are the Arabic words, be among the Christians, right? So there's that, I'm not asking you to evaluate the accuracy of the Quran statement there, but I'm just asking you, what does that make you think of? And then there's another report, which is not in the Quran, but is in the Sirah, or the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, that one reason for the codification of the Quran under the Caliph Uthman was because one of his generals, the Caliph's generals, came to him, Hudhayfa, and said, listen, we've got to get one single book before we're divided as the Jews and Christians are over their book. So any thoughts about that? Like, how much discord and enmity was there among Christians? Are we able to evaluate that in late antiquity at the dawn of Islam?
Yeah, so I think that, those views reflect a world in which, again, the churches are separated and separating, and I think that there is a lot of enmity. You have a Roman emperor who, on a regular basis, Roman emperors from the 5th century into the Islamic period of the Islamic conquest, Roman emperors try to solve the problem of Chalcedon. They try to enforce in various ways, sometimes using violence, enforce uniformity of belief on the churches. And so you have, again, it pops up on a regular basis, these imperial attempts to enforce uniformity of belief, to force people to accept Chalcedon. And so I think the Quran is, and also this anecdote from the Sirah, is reflecting this world in which Christians, think of like Reformation Europe, where you've got, the Calvinists against the Lutherans, against Zwingli and his people, against the Catholics, against the Anglicans, against so that's sort of, what Freud calls the narcissism of minor differences. So I think there's a lot of things people share in common, but it's sort of like, no one can get you as angry as your brother, your sister, your mom, your dad can. The people who are closest to you, the people you have the biggest fights with. And I think there's a lot of that going on. Viewed from 35,000 feet, there's a lot of similarity, but sort of when you're there and looking at it, it's, think of Methodists versus Presbyterians in a small town in America in the 19th century, maybe didn't trust, or versus Baptists or something, right? So I think that the Quran's reflecting that world in which there was a lot of disagreement, and there were debates between Christians, sort of small time debates. There were debates sponsored by emperors. There were charges by Christians against each other. And one of the things that motivates all this Greco-Syriac translation is it's the Christological controversies, and they translate and they retranslate the Bible. They translate and retranslate different church fathers, in part because of the polemical pressure that these separations exert on church leaders, the need to protect your turf, but also you want to engage in some sheep stealing of your own. You want to get people into your own church, right? And so I think the Quran and this angle from the Sira are reflecting that world in which it's a vociferous world, one in which the churches are splitting apart, and there is enmity, and there is. I mean, there's an anecdote in Michael the Syrian. So he's in the 11th century, let's say 12th century. Yeah. But it maybe goes back to an earlier source where the Emperor Heraclius wanted to have people who wouldn't accept. And he says just before the Islamic conquest, if you didn't accept Chalcedon, you'd have your nose cut off or your ear cut off or whatever, right? And so like that happened 250 years before, hundreds of years before Heraclius. But there's this threat of violence for the emperor to cut your nose off. Imagine if Joe Biden wanted to cut your nose off if you didn't accept something from the 18th century. So there is, I think the Quran is reflecting that milieu.
Interesting, yeah, and certainly I can concord or agree with your description of how central, at least to apparently, Christology was the divisions, although in fact the divisions have other factors into them. But when I mention teaching at Notre Dame, the little bit that I address Chalcedon in some of the undergraduate courses, and I explain, well, this was really important, at least to the theologians, and the students are like, why did people get upset about this? And why were they divided about this? I mean, even theologians, as I understand, at sort of ecclesial leaders today, don't find Christology, even across the traditional ecclesial communities who are divided by Christological issues, like that's sort of an easier thing to talk about than maybe some other questions. I don't know if we have to go there, but I wanted to mention that briefly. Actually, if I can sort of take a turn here and ask you a little bit more about the importance of Syriac to understanding the Quran. And then we'll get to your book. We have to spend time speaking about your book because there's so many important insights, including the idea of the simple believer that I want to get to. But just because a lot of the viewers will want to know about what about Syriac in the Quran. So I wanted to give a little bit of backdrop to that and maybe some specific examples. Now, of course, everyone will know that the Quran is in Arabic. The Quran itself says that it is in Arabic. Famously in Surah An-Nahl, the 16th chapter of the Quran, it says, we know that some of them say that only a person is teaching the Prophet, but the tongue of that person is foreign, and this is an Arabic Quran, right? So the Quran itself says that it's in Arabic. Scholars for a long time, and most famously in a book by someone named Arthur Jeffrey, an Australian scholar, have said, well, the Quran does say this, but in fact, we can understand the Quran's vocabulary better when we have recourse to other languages. So there are certain terms which, because of the root not being widely used in Arabic or because of their structure, that seem to come from non-Arabic languages. And, the biggest of those is Syriac. And there's another very influential article written in the early 20th century by a fascinating figure about whom you probably know a lot, Alphonse Mingana, who wrote an influential article at the time about Syriac in the Quran. And for Mingana, I think like everything was Syriac. We've already mentioned the name Christoph Luxemburg, who went well beyond looking at individual words, right, in his book, Syro-Aramaic Reading of the Quran, and argued that, the syntax, the grammar of the Quran is what he calls a mish-shpracha, so a mixed Arabic Syriac text. So, and then, just to give some examples, if we stay on the level of vocabulary, of course, a lot of the proper nouns and names are understood to be somehow reflecting a Syriac substrate. But then there are sort of key items, including the word Quran itself. I don't know if this is right, but scholars will say, well, that ending, that on, Aleph Nun in Arabic ending, would not be typical of Arabic. And so maybe it's from the Syriac kiryana, meaning lectionary. There are other terms too. Hanif is a famous one. Hanif in the context of the Quran seems to mean something like monotheist, but in Syriac, Hampa is a very important word. It's in the Peshitta, I think, the Syriac translation of the Bible in the New Testament, with a meaning either of Gentile or of pagan. Even expressions like subhanallah or when it speaks of the angels praising God, it says Sabahahu, is very close to Shubho in Syriac. So anyway, I've gone on too far already. But so, where would you start? What would be like the first couple of things you would say about Syriac in the Quran?
So first thing I think is, so Arthur Jeffrey, this is one of these things, we're back to what does the word Syriac mean? And so in some of the older literature, when they use the word Syriac, it's not clear to me they're actually speaking about a Decene Aramaic. I think Alphonse Mangana is. I need to go back and look at Jeffrey. He talks about Syriac, but he might qualify it as actually being Christian, what we call today Christian Palestinian Aramaic.
Yes, he does often speak about that. Yes.
Yeah, and so it's one interesting word. Is it Syriac, a Decene Aramaic, or is it another kind of Aramaic? That's one of the things I would ask. The other thing is, I mean, in a previous life, when I was a graduate student, I remember spending some time with the Itqan of Suyuti, which is absolutely marvelous book. And if I remember correctly, he's got a section in there on foreign words in the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
And so which he lists a whole bunch of words, and he knows Arabic better than probably anybody watching this video ever will know Arabic, right? Suyuti was the master, right? And so I think he didn't find that threatening. I think today it can be controversial because of all kinds of reasons. But I think within the tradition itself, there's a recognition that there are maybe some non-Arabic words in the Quran. Now, that's totally to be expected. I think there are maybe some languages, if you live on an island and no one's ever been to that island, you're going to have a language that has no, non-whatever indigenous words in it.
Right.
But every linguistic community is in touch with other linguistic communities. Look at the words, all the words for opera in English, and they're all from Italian, right? We call a piano, that's an Italian word. And so the fact that there could be words in the Quran that are from a foreign, a non-Arabic language, I think it's totally fine and totally to be expected. And I think it points to the, and those words could be sort of Arabized. They become Arabic words. They may in origin have been from Syriac or from Ethiopic or from whatever, and they become Arabic words. Like the word piano is now an English word, even though it's originally from Italian. So I think of it in those terms, so that there would be words in the Quran from Aramaic or from Decene Aramaic does not surprise me at all. And I think that when these things get controversial, it's when people start getting sort of on the grassy knoll and get conspiracy theories and this sort of thing. And I'm sort of temperamentally disinclined for conspiracy theories. Maybe it's a weakness in my own character. But yeah, I think it's totally, so the word cariono, it's the word for lectionary readings every week in church. And cariane, whatever it is, whatever the plural is. And so that it could be, I'm not a historical linguist, I'm not a Semitic, I'm interested in Semitic language, but I'm not a Semitic linguist, and they can debate these things, but it strikes me as being plausible that word could have come into Arabic from Aramaic, a Decene or Christian Palestinian, and could have been, the thing is, it's for me is interesting is there is an audience to the Quran. When Muhammad recites these surahs, these verses to people, he's presumably not reciting them, to an empty street. There are people listening. And my presumption is that people can understand this, and these words make sense to people. So what does it say to you about the world in which that community, that linguistic community is functioning? If people on the streets in Mecca or Medina in 615 or 625 or whatever could understand when Muhammad says whatever, he talks about Ibrahim or talks about whatever, what does it say about that community and the world and their sort of mental world that these words were intelligible to them? What were the religious structures? What were the religious stories that were told? What were the movements of people that made these Aramaic words or these Ethiopic words, which had been Arabized, whatever, part of their everyday language? Right. That to me is a very interesting question. So it's given the importance of Syriac and the religious history of the late antique Middle East, again, it's used from Egypt all the way to China. There's a huge literature in it used by people from different groups, and people are engaged in trading. We've got the so-called, there's Christians in Hemyar in the 6th century who are writing letters in Syriac, and that's
Southern Arabia.
Yeah, Southern Arabia. And so the fact that there's Syriac, knowledge of Syriac present in Southern Arabia in the 6th century before the birth of the prophet tells you Syriac it's known in Arabia.
So can I ask a little bit more about that picture that you're sort of painting for us? I mean, if we don't entertain a really revisionist picture of where Islam began. And if we stick with the traditional picture of Islam beginning in Mecca, in the Hijaz, in Western Arabia, we know, especially from the work that's been done recently on inscriptions, that there were Arabic speakers. There were different ancient North Arabian dialects in this region, of which Classical Arabic or Old Arabic is one of them. And we know that the Arabic script is developing in the 5th, 6th centuries on the basis of the Nabatean Aramaic script. Now, Nabatean is a community that probably, well, you could clarify this better than I could, but used both Aramaic and Arabic. Maybe we can leave it at that, and was in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia and Jordan. So the Arabic script is developing from there. But what I really want to get to is, so if we look at the Hijaz, Western Arabia, and there are Arabic speakers there, if there were Christians in the region, and recent epigraphy suggests there were, most of our inscriptions from the 6th and even the 5th century in the Arabic script are Christian. As far as we know, the Bible would have been well known in Syriac. Was it known in Arabic at all? Was there liturgy going on in Arabic? Or would lived Christianity be always in a process of translating things from Syriac or another Aramaic dialect into Arabic, which would have been the native language? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so let me go back to, in the introduction, you talked about I was working on this Karshuni edition of the life of Theodota, or Theodotus of Amid. So what is Karshuni? So like in Lebanon, you say Karshuni, this means, oh, it's something you can't understand. It means it's nonsense. But actually Karshuni is Arabic written in the Syriac script. And so what I've been doing the past, few days is I have worked on this text, and it's written in Karshuni, and I'm comparing this translation of a saint's life. It was translated in the early 18th century. It was written in Syriac probably in the early 8th century. I'm comparing an Arabic translation to the Syriac original, and both are in the Syriac script. And if you spend a lot of time with these two languages, like the boundary between the two gets kind of confusing. You can't remember, like, is this an Arabic or is this a Syriac? They all sort of blend together, right? And so, and you can't remember, what does this root mean in this language versus this root in that language? And it's hard to keep them separate in your mind. So if you have a community that's very bilingual, it's very easy sort of to, there's certain idioms you read in a Christian, you find this in Christian Arabic more generally. You'll read stuff in Christian Arabic that it seems really funny to you in Arabic, but like, actually this person's thinking in Syriac, or this person this is being translated out of Syriac, right? And so there's this, I think, a problem with Americans is Americans are so monolingual, and they don't, the experience of being in a bilingual or multilingual sort of mixed melting pot type linguistic place is foreign to a lot of English speakers. So that's the first thing. Second thing I'd say is this question about, is there an Arabic Bible before the rise of Islam? And this is a very controversial topic. It's been debated and written about. My own view is that I think parts of the Bible are probably present in Arabic before the rise of Islam. I think parts of them are probably present there liturgically, and I think it probably could have been translated from Syriac. So I wonder if some of the sort of Syriac, elements that people see in the Quran, if that's actually not, back to our picture, if you're on the streets in Mecca or Medina in the year 615 or 625, and you hear certain names and certain stories being read, how would people know those things? Mm-hmm. Well, if people are aware of these stories liturgically, they've heard these things in a church context, it can explain a lot of things. And if the translation that's being used for the lectionary, if that translation is done from Syriac, it could explain the sort of presence of Syriac sounding things that people like Christoph Luxemburg or Alphonse Mangana find. To me, it's a much more elegant solution to this question, to this riddle, than some of, I think, the other things that people might have in mind. Now, is there, the Quran, Gabriel, you know the Quran better than I do. The Quran actually quotes the Psalms. It quotes Psalm, I think, 24, if I'm not mistaken. It actually, there's an actual a quote from the Psalms. And what's the most important?
Surah 21 is the famous passage.
Yeah, and so what's the most widely cited book in all of Christian late antique literature? I think it's the book of Psalms. Number 2 is the book of Matthew. Daniel of Salah, a 6th century, very important Syrian Orthodox Miaphysite exegete, says the book of the Psalms, he says the book of Psalms contains the entire story of of God's action in the world, from creation to fall to redemption. It's all there. To be a deacon, to be ordained as a deacon, I think, in the Church of the East, you have to have the Psalter memorized, right? And so the Psalms are an extremely widely known book. They're known liturgically. And so it's not a coincidence, I think, that if one part of the Bible is quoted in the Quran, it'd be the book of Psalms. If you had to ask,
it's the only biblical book, if it's the right way to put it, that's referred to by name. It's the term Zabur is debated. I mean, its origin, where it comes from, whether it's just from the Arabic word meaning writing, or is it somehow connected to Hebrew mizmor? I think in Syriac it's related to
whatever it is.
Yeah. So, wow. Okay.
No, but so the thing is, why? Okay, if there's a pre-Islamic Arabic Bible, why don't we have one that survives? Mm-hmm. That to me is honestly not a very good argument, because survival is always a miracle. That we have anything that survives from that long ago is a miracle. The question is, where would it survive? Where would the centers of pre-Islamic Arabic-speaking Christianity have been? Places like Hira, which doesn't even exist anymore. Places like in South Arabia, which don't exist anymore. The communities where these things would have been used don't exist. Those places aren't around. Those communities have converted to Islam. And so there is no living community to preserve a text. Sebastian Brock told me this years ago. He said, to preserve a text, you have to have a community. The community of pre-Islamic Arabic-speaking Christians those are for the most part gone. I have a cousin in Jordan whose wife told me she's from the Ghassasina. So maybe there are people in Jordan from the tribe of Ghassan or maybe I don't know. Yes. Yeah, the Ghassanids are still around in Jordan, but the pre-Islamic Arabic-speaking Christians of the Arabian Peninsula don't exist anymore. And so absent those communities, or absent the finding of a jar from a monastic library, community, of course it's not going to exist. Now, to say that there was a Bible in Arabic before Islam, not to say there was the Song of Songs, or there was, Hosea or Habakkuk or whatever, what would have existed would have been enough to get you through a liturgy, right? So portions would have been translated, I'm guessing from Syriac. And so if there is a pre-Islamic Arabic translation of the Bible, it's portions of it, probably from Syriac. And this could help explain the mental image I have of how people on the streets of Mecca or Medina in 615 or 625 could hear a story recited by the prophet. And it would make sense to them if he refers to Aaron or John the Baptist in his recitation, or Jesus or Mary or Moses, all these different people, they're all there. So the Quran presumes an audience that is familiar with these biblical figures.
Right. Interesting too, the Quran explicitly associates David with the Psalms. And so that notion, which although David is a musician and sings in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, but I think it's a traditional association that he's the author of the Psalms, which is found in the Quran as well. So it's
in Syriac, the Psalter called David. I mean, the Psalter is called David. You know what I'm saying? So like when you talk about that, so it's, again, the Quran makes sense in a late antique world. And again, I'm probably putting out on YouTube like my own conspiracy theories, but I think it requires a lot less effort and a lot less sort of epicycles to assume that there is some sort of partially available Arabic text of the Bible in Arabia and Western Arabia also, that could explain how can the audience of the Quran, how does the Quran have an audience that can understand what it's saying? What sort of conditions do you need socially and culturally to have that? If I go to, I don't know, some island in the middle Pacific that's been isolated from all of humanity for the past 5,000 years and talk about Star Trek to them, they wouldn't understand what Star Trek is, right? And so if I talk about Captain Kirk, that presumes you've heard of Star Trek.
Right. Well put. Well, before we wrap up, I want to make sure that we spend a couple minutes at least on your book. It deserves a whole episode by itself. This again, friends, this is the magnificent book, The Making of the Medieval Middle East, Religion, Society, and Simple Believers. I want to ask about that concept of simple believers, but first, can you just introduce, what led to that particular project? Why did you see that this is an area that needed study and research?
Well, again, it's a lot of it's just, for me, I think Nietzsche says somewhere you must learn to see the profile of an author and his works. And for me, it's just autobiography. I was interested in Christians in the Middle East, and interested in understanding how do you go from having a Middle East that on the eve of the rise of Islam is largely Christian, at least the formerly Roman Middle East, it's largely Christian, to being a Middle East today where Christians are a minority and a shrinking minority. How does that process happen? I was just very interested in that. And I read around it. There's treatments. It wasn't a topic that had been studied very closely. It's being studied a lot now, but back in the late 90s, early 2000s, it wasn't as widely studied. So I had that question, where did the Christians go? What happened to the Christians? And then again, I was interested, you study about Chalcedon, you study about debates about the Trinity, and you look at, they're kind of hard to understand for a lot of people, including me. And my father's family, the generation of his parents, they're mostly illiterate, largely illiterate. They lived through 1948 war and the war in Lebanon. And, my dad thought the earth was flat. And so I was like, how do people who don't have much education, how do they understand Chalcedon? And how do they understand the doctrine of the Trinity, right? And it hit me. I always thought, oh, maybe this is, maybe there's some kind of decline and fall. Maybe everybody back in the 4th, 5th century was actually super educated. And maybe it was like, modern Switzerland or something like that. They're all going to school. And there's been some kind of period of decline. Everybody fell away. And then it hit me at a certain point. I was like, well, actually, maybe what if everybody actually was illiterate back then too? And you read around and they probably were illiterate back then too. And what does it mean? And then I had come across, there's a guy called Jacob of Edessa who dies in 708. He's a very, very super learned Syrian Orthodox Miaphysite scholar. He knows Greek, he knows Syriac, he translates Aristotle, he translates the Bible. He's a very learned, very difficult guy. And I came across a thing, a letter in which someone asked him, if someone's parents were heretics, by which he probably meant Chalcedonians, and they want to have a sort of a commemoration for them in a liturgy, is that okay in an Orthodox, i.e. Miaphysite church? Is that okay? He says, well, it depends on what kind of heretics they were. If they were people who promoted the Chalcedonian ideas, I paraphrase here, no. But if they were just simple people, it's okay. And so this idea in Syriac is called the pshite, the simple. And that sort of stuck with me for years. And then
there's the unfortunate Greek version of that, I think, right? Of that term.
Well, so it's so in Greek it's apollos or aplusteros, and then it's also idiotis.
That's the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, so it's a Syriac word, which is hediota in Syriac. Comes into Syriac too. It just means a simple, unlearned person. And I had a philosophy professor's undergrad who had in this class about Nietzsche again. He explained to us what Nietzsche's will to power meant, and he said, "Look, guys, look, folks. Once you understand the will to power, what it is, you see it everywhere." And I had this simple believer moment. I was like, once I realized there's this notion of the simple out there, it's all over late antique Christian literature. The simple believer. And bishops talk about these bad guys trying to seduce the simple. It's used in all kinds of different ways. And you can try to reduce it to rhetoric, but I think there's an idea out there, and I think it's very powerful. And you see it in stuff up to the 20th century. I've seen people refer to simple Christians, just everyday Christians who aren't professional Christians, who aren't professional Muslims. They talk about the Khasa Ni'ama in Islamic sources too, just everyday believers who are just trying to make it. And they got a day job. They're not studying they don't have all the books in Arabic on their back shelf like you do. You know what I'm saying? It's like they got, you see, I got the camera position, so you can't see what a mess my office is here in my attic. But so I'm a disaster. But so they don't have the time, they don't have the leisure. The word scholarship comes from the word leisure. They don't have the free time to study this stuff. And they might not, if they had it, they probably wouldn't study this stuff. So how do those folks fit into the picture? Because the image of late antique religion, or medieval religion for that matter, that I think people get, I think both Christian and Muslim, is very much an elite one. It's one where the people you read about, they are supreme masters of their tradition, and they know their stuff. They know their Quran, they know their Bible, they know their fiqh, they know all that stuff. What about everybody else? And so I had this question, where do the Christians go? And I had this other question of, what about everyday people? And I realized you can't really answer one without answering the other. And I think that for me, to understand what happens in the Middle Ages with Christians and Muslims, in part, you have to understand what happens with Chalcedon and the world Chalcedon creates. So that's where that book comes from. It's just me trying to sort out questions I had in my head from when I was an undergrad. Kind of got out of control.
Yeah, there's so many great anecdotes in the book, and it's intellectually brilliant, but it's also great to read. I mean, it's just a wonderful read. And I love the point where you say, I forget exactly what musical analogy, but you say like mastering theology for a Christian, and later up you follow in later chapters about Islam, you say, well, it's similar for Muslims too. was like some sort of sonata, Chopin or something. I forget. Do you
Chopin,
remember?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like
so
it's not easy. You have to be a master to actually, get the precise categories down. And
it's I say orthodox belief. There's a presumption in scholarship that orthodox belief is the norm. It may be the norm in the churches, but go to the pews. Forget about what's on the "we believe" statement in the church bulletin, or what's in the Denzinger or whatever his canons, the his councils of the Catholic Church, whatever. Forget about that. Go to the pews and interview people and see what they actually think. And I think you'll find widely divergent views in the pews, so to speak. They didn't have pews in late antiquity, sort of in the congregation, that diverge quite markedly from what's on the books. I think that's the case with Muslims. It's the case with Christians. Because I think in order to actually be Orthodox, not just belong to a church that professes Orthodoxy, but yourself be Orthodox, you have to be trained. You have to be taught. You have to read. You have to study. It's like learning how to play Chopin well. These things just don't happen. Right? It's sort of like watching a figure skater nail a landing, or a gymnast nail a landing, whatever. These things, it's you got to thread the needle to get your things right. And so when orthodoxy is defined in heavily propositional ways, it's difficult. So I think that, again, and maybe we're living in a post-Reformation, post-print, I don't know what world. People can read, there's high levels of literacy, so we conceptualize what it means to be a Christian, or be a Muslim for that matter, in very highly intellectualized ways. But I think that in the late antique period, ritual and its ability to shape your life and to take you you're part of a story of God's action in the world, a Muslim story, a Christian story, and you live your life in the context of that story, and you learn that story from the liturgy. In a Christian context, and you take part in the life of the church, and that's what shapes you, I think. I mean, again, I'm not a theologian. This is just my own reflections.
No, it's really well, but
So
I have just two final questions, and then I'll leave you in peace. Stop bugging you. The first is, there's the element of the book which enters into early Islam, the early Islamic period. And so I wanted to ask you a bit about that, and maybe misconceptions people have about sort of on the ground interactions between Muslims and Christians. So, some people, I think we hear sort of two like widely contrasting narratives. One is, there was enmity from the beginning, and, Islam was violent towards Christians. And there's this phrase, dhimmatud, not only the Christians, but to Jews and others as well. And then we hear the opposite narrative, which is no, especially in the context of Andalusia, Spain, or Baghdad in the 9th century, maybe, but generally that Islam was very generous and magnanimous in its treatment of non-Muslims, and Christians, especially in the Middle East at the dawn of Islam, they were so glad to cast off the yoke of the Byzantine Empire and welcome their new overlords with open arms, and everything. Relations are always great unless someone interferes from the outside, So based on your research from the book or other thoughts, like what was it actually like in, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries on the ground?
So I think it depends very much on where you are and sort of what the weather is that day. I think it's really hard to make broad brush statements. I think that there's an idea, because of the Christological controversies, because of the meddling, at times violent meddling from the Byzantine emperor, that people were happy to throw off his yoke. But I think it's also important to point out that the emperor was a Christian emperor. And I think that Christians, regardless of their confession, still looked up to him as sort of a very important figure. And one piece of evidence for that is the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, which is written in the late 7th century, which very well may have been written by a Chalcedonian. But I think the first time it's cited is by a member of the Church of the East, so-called Nestorian. And it's preserved largely, or maybe exclusively, in Miaphysite manuscripts. And why? So the star of this, one of the stars is the Roman emperor, is one of the stars of this thing. And what does the Roman emperor do? He comes back at the end of time and he defeats the Muslims, right? And so if people were so happy to cast off the Roman emperor's yoke, why were they preserving down through the Middle Ages a text in which the Byzantine emperor, the Roman emperor, would come and liberate the Middle East if people were so happy to cast off his yoke? So I think that one thing itself, and this is a widely influential, it's a hugely influential apocalyptic text throughout the Middle Ages, East and West. It's translated into Latin, it gets into Slavonic, it gets into Greek. very quickly after its composition in the late 7th century. So the very fact of that text transmission and preservation in Syriac by non-Chalcedonian communities, I think, tells you that the emperor was a symbol of hope, regardless of his confession, because he was a Christian emperor. That complicates things. The first thing. Second thing is, I think the idea of violent forced conversion, I mean, I think there was forced conversion of some Christian Arab tribes to Islam. But apart from that, there are moments of violent forced conversion, say under Al-Hakam in the 11th century, or in the Mamluk period, especially in the 14th century, in sort of the post-Crusader moment. But there are long periods when this sort of stuff isn't happening. And I think people, there's different kinds of tolerance. There's also I think it's been called rough tolerance, sort of the tolerance of everyday life. People might have like a consciously articulated 21st century notion of tolerance is developed in the context of a pluralistic democracy, liberal democracy, or whatever. But there's an idea of like, this guy living next door to me and his family, they're nice people, and they loan me a stick of butter when I'm baking a cake, right? There's that kind of tolerance. I think it's widespread and ubiquitous in the Middle East, that people, okay, on the books, maybe you think I'm a polytheist, I'm a mushrik because I believe in the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. But you know what? We'll still
we'll still have a cup of tea together.
We'll have a cup of tea. I think that is widespread throughout the early Middle Ages. I think another thing to keep in mind with the Islamic conquest is there's not that many Muslims in the early Islamic period. There's not that many Muslims. Again, numbers, the demographic game, the nose counting game is a very hard game to play. And if anybody tells you it's more than just educated guessing, they're not telling you the truth. But I think Patricia Crone estimated between 200 and 500,000 Muslims immigrate out of Arabia and spread throughout the conquered territories from Spain all the way to Central Asia, 20 or 30 million people. So there's 200,000, 500,000 people in the context of 20 or 30 million non-Muslims. There's not that many Muslims. If you look at the Islamic sources, and again, we can debate the whole revisionism versus non-revisionist thing. My own inclinations, again, aren't towards revisionism. Maybe that's just a problem I have, but I tend to think the broad outlines of the tradition are reliable. But if you believe the sources, most Muslims only convert to Islam towards the end of the Prophet's life, and they convert en masse. And again, ask yourself, if you're there, what does it mean to be a Muslim? If someone you belong to a tribe which someone has gone to the Prophet and converted on behalf of the entire tribe, what do you know about Islam? Are you a low information Muslim or a high information Muslim? Again, I think the assumption is that most Christians and Muslims in our period are high information Christians, high information Muslims. I think probably most people are low information Christians and low information Muslims. And so I think in terms of Christian-Muslim relations, I think it's often the case. This is an idea that I had to sort of think my way out of it, unthink this in my own thoughts, that to be a Christian, Muslim, whatever interaction in the 7th century was, let's go debate the Trinity. Let's debate the Dala'il Nubuwah, whatever. Signs of prophethood. Right. Let's debate the incarnation. Maybe or maybe not. Again, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. And then again, look at the internet these days. It's like the Wild West. The level of Christian-Muslim debate on the internet, which I've sort of dipped my fingers in recently, just sort of looked at, the level of information is appallingly low. It's really a lot of misinformation, but maybe that's our period was like. People just,
it's all going to change now with
it's going to change
with
it
this interview.
Right here. It starts right here.
Exactly.
So I think that I think we have to assume that there's a lot of if there probably are discussions and there probably are debates. I think that Theophanes is a Greek historian in the 9th century. He records I think in the mid 8th century there's a governor of Iraq, Muslim governor of Iraq, who forbade Christians from talking to Muslims about matters of faith. So I think we have to assume there are a lot of discussions going on. Were these discussions highly informed? I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably not. But I think that there is some mutual self-definition, that Christians define themselves in the context of Muslim polemics against them and vice versa. And I think that someone like you who's worked on Abdul Jabbar and these sorts of texts, you'd be very well equipped to talk about that more, but what, in the same way that Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism sort of mutually self-defined in an earlier period, does that happen with Christianity and Islam? My instinct would be to say, yes, it does. And so I think different times, different places, relations are probably pretty good. Different times, different places, relations are pretty bad. And the question becomes a political, cultural one. Why do relations, what activates animosity between these communities? What activates, is it when the Byzantines if say the Byzantines attack this year, does that trigger a persecution of Christians in Baghdad that year? I mean, are there external political factors that are happening? Is there competition in the bureaucracy between Christian secretaries and Muslim secretaries? What are the factors that sort of lead these sort of on paper disagreements to be activated and have real life consequences? And so in the first 3 or 4 centuries, again, different times, different places, I think there are good times and there are not so good times. But I think that like it's important for me to keep in mind that, again, not everybody's a bishop, not everybody's a mutakallim, not everybody's a faqih or whatever. Like that, you know, not everybody is hafiz of Quran.
Yes.
Not everybody, you know. But what are those debates? What might those debates look like? And what, you know, anyway, so that's my sort of long and not very helpful answer to that question. But that's
That was a very helpful answer, and does justice to a very complicated matter. So thank you for that. And then the last thing, what are you working on now? What should people watching know about the current and future projects of Professor Jack Tannous?
So I'm coming out of a year and a half of COVID when I have 2 small children. It was a brutal year, but in theory, I'm working on a book that's about the history of Syriac scholarship and the history of Greco-Syriac translation. So from the 4th to 10th century, and sort of looking at the development of Syriac intellectual culture in that period. It's a very interesting, again, from the eve of Chalcedon till, you know, it's in the 10th century when Syriac starts really being eclipsed by Arabic among Christians, I would say. And looking at that and the sort of the heyday of Greco-Syriac translation and Syriac scribal culture. That's one thing. I'm also working on this, trying to finish this edition of the Karshuni Life of Theodota. Robert Hoyland and Andrew Palmer are waiting for me right now. They're done with their parts. It's up to me.
You're gonna be wondering why you're spending time with me.
Yeah, no, it's good.
Why isn't that guy doing his translation?
So those are 2 things I'm working on. And I'm also interested in Christian Arabic. I would love to spend more time with Christian Arabic. I think it's a great topic. It's tremendously understudied, and there is just so much to do. And so those are things I'm interested in right now. I'm also supposed to be like editing a book or 2, and probably also I owe a lot of people emails I haven't answered, but that's a different story. But anyways, that's what I'm supposed to work on a book, and I'm this edition right now.
Yeah, great. It's been such a pleasure, Professor Tannous. Thanks for speaking with me. And I just thought it was great. We covered a lot of ground, but there's so many other questions we could ask you. Maybe to be continued. But thank you.
Maybe to be continued. It's been a joy, Gabriel. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, take care. Well, friends, thanks for being with us for this episode of Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I hope you found it to be an edifying discussion. I really hope that you find generally the content on this channel to be useful. There's a really diverse range of things in regard to Quranic studies and biblical studies with top-notch scholars. And we'll be really grateful for your support. So please don't hesitate to like the videos, starting with this one maybe, to subscribe to the channel and to share the news with your friends about exploring the Quran and the Bible.